United States President Donald Trump made it clear to the allies that he is convinced of Russia's victory. Multiple media outlets are reporting this information today, attributing it to the agency. These circumstances are causing deep concern in Kyiv and Brussels, who believe that only Washington among the allies has the power to force Putin to stop the war. In addition, today United States Secretary of State Mark Rubio says that the United States can no longer solve all the world's problems. Trump also mentions that dealing with Zelensky is allegedly challenging, but he thinks Zelensky wants to end the war. In addition, the politician writes that the United States is against promises of support for Ukraine and condemnation of Russia's war in the final statement. And to all this, he adds that the conversation between Trump and Putin showed that ending the war in Ukraine is not expected anytime soon. But still, the main focus in the news today is that supposedly Trump said he is confident in Russia's victory. But here, things are far from straightforward if we start reading the original sources. Because there is one nuance in Donald Trump's statement that I think many people understood completely differently from how it was actually said. So let's figure out together whether the American president is really publicly abandoning Ukraine and whether we can say that no negotiations are expected in the near future. I'm Alexei Pechi. Today is May 21st. Let's go through this step by step. Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and be sure to leave a comment. Also subscribe to the Telegram channel Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as soon as it comes in. So, I'll start with the news that was published today by the agency and then was widely shared by many media outlets. Despite the minimal successes of the Russian army on the battlefield, United States President Donald Trump has made significant diplomatic moves toward the agenda promoted by the Kremlin. As the publication points out, during negotiations with his American counterpart, Russian President Vladimir Putin tried to buy time. And he succeeded because after the phone conversation, Trump made it clear that he was abandoning demands for a ceasefire and threats of sanctions against Russia. According to people familiar with the closed-door negotiations between Trump and his European allies, the United States president made it clear that he was convinced of Russia's victory, repeating a number of Kremlin talking points, which raised concerns among Europeans that the United States intended to move away from its much-publicized commitment to reach a quick peace agreement. As reported, Trump has repeatedly criticized Zelensky, most notably in the Oval Office on February 28th. At the same time, he did not exert significant pressure on Putin, as evidenced by his refusal to threaten additional sanctions if Putin refused an unconditional ceasefire. Jack Watling, Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the Royal United Services Institute in London, said that diplomatic retreat only plays into the hands of Vladimir Putin. Quote, Russia cannot sustain operations indefinitely, but at the moment Moscow believes that its influence over Ukraine will increase over time. And since Trump has strongly hinted that he will withdraw from the negotiations, Russian military forces intend to step up their operations. This situation is causing deep concern in Kyiv, which believes that only Washington among its allies has the power to force Putin to stop the war. Not to mention Ukraine's dependence on United States military aid, ranging from Patriot air defense systems to intelligence information received thanks to Starlink. Nevertheless, according to Watling, the Kremlin will also have to make a difficult choice as the war continues. Although Russia may be able to conduct 2 more campaign seasons with its current approach to troop recruitment. Further offensive operations in 2026 will likely require additional forced mobilization, which is a difficult task both politically and economically. So, it all comes down to Trump believing Putin when he claims he's ready to fight forever, as they say. And that's why Trump supposedly, I emphasize, stated that he is confident in Russia's victory. But here we need to take a short pause and figure out what Bloomberg is actually writing. There's one interesting point that many people overlooked for some reason. The thing is that in all the media, with reference to Bloomberg, they write that Trump made it clear to Europeans that he is convinced of Russia's victory. In fact, the text says that Trump made it clear that he is convinced that Russia is winning at the present time. Not in the future, not in general, but at the present time. Supposedly, he saw that along the front line, Russia is winning. Well, indeed, we have to admit that the Russians, although slowly, are unfortunately advancing along the front line right now. So basically, this is what they started paying more and more attention to in the White House. But here the key point is, and again, we need to look at the data on offensive operations. Because even Bloomberg writes about how they compare the pace of advancement. The last 4.5 months of 2024 and the first 4.5 months of 2025, and on average, it turns out that there were 125 square kilometers per week of Russian advancement that year, and this year it's 41 square kilometers. That is, as you understand, 3 times slower. That is, in this same article it is written that the Russians are slowing down in their advance, but Trump still says that they are winning at the moment. And here the logic starts to emerge as I see it. I could be wrong, of course, but Trump seems to have simply decided to give Putin time so that he could probably seize more territory and then return to these negotiations again. That is, Trump has not managed to somehow convince Putin to sit down at the negotiating table, but he is also not going to put pressure on him. Why? Because, as you remember, after his conversation with Putin, he stated that Russia really wants to conduct large-scale trade with the United States of America. Here, of course, there are questions about what exactly they are planning to trade. Let's turn on some logic here. Russia mainly sells to the world market. No, not technology, not some goods, but raw materials, oil, gas, and maybe some rare earth metals and other minerals. So, in fact, it's raw materials. Does America need to buy raw materials from Russia? No. Can America sell some goods to Russia? Yes. So, in fact, that's the case. Trump's logic is that he just wants to capture this Russian market to sell his goods there. But what he plans to buy from Russia is absolutely unclear. There's no point because of the oil, gas, and everything else there. Even if we hypothetically assume that America suddenly, by some miracle, is going to buy raw materials from Russia, well, how would that work? It's absolutely pointless to transport it over such a long distance. Nevertheless, but again, we shouldn't have any illusions because Trump, in fact, right now, is abandoning Ukraine. Why? Let's do it this way, point by point. Trump has never once pressured Putin to stop the war. In his conversations with him, he didn't even bring up the topic of a ceasefire. Sources are talking about this now. After the call, Trump effectively backed away from his own promise to stop the war. The 2-hour conversation with Putin on May 19th was so warm that neither Trump nor Putin wanted to be the first to hang up. That's what Russians are saying now. European allies and Ukrainian authorities felt that they had been abandoned without explanation, without any position. So Trump and Putin talked and then everything went quiet. Moreover, the United States is no longer attempting to mediate, instead pushing the initiative onto others in recent weeks. They say maybe the Vatican should handle it, or maybe the Europeans, or perhaps Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, should take care of it. Then Trump hints that maybe the Chinese should be involved in this initiative. Well, in any case, in the White House, they're trying to wash their hands of it, step aside and say that this isn't our war, as they call it. And they don't want to be intermediaries anymore. Again, after the conversation with Putin, the United States president publicly stated that he didn't even mention the missile strikes on peaceful Ukrainians during that conversation. This is after Trump wrote on Truth Social that Vladimir should stop. Another issue emerges as Mark Rubio, the United States Secretary of State, declared that the United States can no longer resolve all global problems. Quote, "There are many things in the world that deserve attention. A lot of terrible things are happening. The United States will not be able to solve all the problems. It is necessary to maintain a focus on national interests." He stated this at the budget hearings in the relevant committee of the House of Representatives. When asked if he considers Putin a war criminal, Marco Rubio was unable to answer. He repeated 3 times that this is a person with whom we are trying to negotiate. When asked if he is a war criminal, he responds that the events in Ukraine appear to be war crimes. They ask him again, is Putin a war criminal or not? Rubio says again, well, this is a person we are negotiating with. In addition, according to Rubio, the previous United States administration led by Joe Biden, quote, acted irresponsibly by freezing negotiations with Russia for 3 years. The United States needs to negotiate with Russia to prevent miscalculations and conflicts, but friendly relations will only be established if the conditions change. Continuing on this topic, it should be added that Trump does not comment on Putin at all, I mean critically. But he does say that Ukraine is ready for a ceasefire. But time is needed to assess Kyiv's efforts, not Putin's, to achieve peace. As Trump stated, I mentioned that Ukraine is prepared for a ceasefire and peace negotiations. What's the next step? To a clarifying question about whether Ukraine is doing enough to achieve peace, the American president replied that he needs more time for more precise conclusions. And then a quote from Trump. I would rather tell you in about 2 weeks because I can't say yes or no. This is the question again. Is Ukraine doing enough to stop the fighting? Ukraine is the victim in this war. I continue to quote Trump. I think Zelensky is a tough guy and he's not easy to deal with, but I think he wants to stop. It's a very bad thing. What's happening there? I think he wants to stop. But I could answer this question better in 2 or 4 weeks. I hope the answer will be that he wants to solve this problem. Once again, Zelensky is being blamed for everything and portrayed as being at fault. Moreover, now there is information that the United States has spoken out against promises of further support for Ukraine and against phrases about the illegality of the war started by the Russian Federation. In the statement of the G7, the publication Politico writes that during the coordination of the joint statement of the G7 problems arose due to the position of Donald Trump's administration. Washington is against including a phrase about further support for Ukraine in the statement. In addition, the Americans want to avoid describing Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine as an illegal invasion. I don't know what Trump is going to call it, but they want to exclude all these critical points and critical statements about the Russians as much as possible. Plus, they're saying, let's remove this promise to continue supporting Ukraine altogether. Well, and at the end, I'll add a few more quotes from the publication which directly state that the conversation between Trump and Putin showed that an end to the war in Ukraine is not expected. A phone conversation between Trump and Putin, he interrupted attempts to put pressure on Russia with the aim of an immediate ceasefire, and instead opened the way for continued fighting during prolonged negotiations. As it is written, Trump's reluctance to push Russia toward a truce indicates that he may withdraw from participating in the negotiations, which his team has been signaling for several weeks now. I'll quote further. A little over a week ago, European leaders were planning with United States officials to impose new sanctions against Russia if it did not agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. But despite Trump's months-long calls for an immediate end to the fighting, the United States president, who once promised to end the war in 24 hours, it seems he not only avoided European plans, but also abandoned his own call for a quick ceasefire. At the same time, during a phone conversation with Trump, Putin managed to add a new element of delay to the process. The need for each side to prepare a memorandum on the terms of a future peace agreement is a step that could make Ukraine vulnerable while negotiations drag on. This is what I mentioned in one of the previous episodes, that in fact we have returned to the starting point of the negotiations. Explain to me, why are new conditions needed? Why would Ukraine and Russia write out new terms for a ceasefire when the positions have long been absolutely clear? And there is Donald Trump's proposal of 22 points for achieving peace in Ukraine, which Vitkov took to Putin in Moscow and St. Petersburg and showed him there. Perhaps we can proceed along this path. So, it turns out that Trump made the proposal and then he himself rejected all of it. He says, oh, great idea. Let Ukraine and Russia put forward their own conditions for a ceasefire. We'll bring them together and try to find a compromise. So, in fact, all these 3 months of attempts, even more than 3 months of trying to find a solution for a ceasefire, they just go up in smoke, into the fireplace, sorry. That's it, we're back to square one. In addition, as he notes, after the third phone conversation between Trump and Putin since his inauguration, it is already possible to identify patterns of interaction. The United States is demanding that Putin show he is serious about peace negotiations. In response, the Kremlin insists that the complexity of a broader peace agreement is hindering an immediate ceasefire. Well, it seems that Putin managed to offer Trump an interim tangible result from Washington's peace efforts without making any concessions at all. Well, and as Trump's hint that Russia and Ukraine will have to negotiate a ceasefire between themselves suggests, it also implies a reduction of United States involvement in this process. And all this raises doubts about whether a deal can be reached even by the end of this year. It is believed that Putin is convinced that Russia is gaining the upper hand in this war and can gain more territory during the summer fighting season. And only then will it start to approach the issue of negotiations. Trump has taken the position that we're not involved at all and we won't impose any sanctions. I'll explain in the next episode why Trump's team said directly that there won't be any sanctions. They threatened. Are we going to carry out the threat? No, we won't. Why? Because that's the explanation in the White House. No threats, no pressure, nothing. In the morning, they'll try, to back out and say that someone else should deal with all these issues. We tried, it didn't work out, we moved on. That's all for now, friends. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, hit the bell, and like this video.